Good evening. January 1st, 2013. The world didn't end, did it? I knew it wasn't going to end because I got an email from a Mayan elder from Mexico who had his schedule for the spring. I said, good. He must know something. The world is not coming to an end. This room is filled with something called space. Everywhere we move in this space, we are moving through consciousness itself. And this consciousness is bound by these walls. These walls create a boundary through which consciousness itself can manifest its own qualities. And I'll be discussing this throughout the context of this lecture. I'd like to begin with a little bit of background on this field that Ganapati Stapati has called Mayanic Science and Technology. What I speak of today comes from this tradition of Vishwakarmas. It may conflict with things that you already know, although likely it will agree with everything you've ever known. Just for a minute, imagine what was happening on this planet about 15,000 BC. There were massive ice sheets covering the entire expanse of the northern hemisphere. They were slowly moving forward in what is called the Fifth Ice Age. Then about 14,000 BC, they stopped progressing. The planet had a slight warming. It remained that way for about 2,000 years, give or take. Then we had another sudden warming of this glacial, of this planet. Now, during this time, there was a place along the equatorial belt that was inhabited. It was warm enough, luxurious enough for people to survive happily. Now we know that during the Fifth Ice Age there were people living in the colder regions, but they were only struggling for life. And while they were hitting each other over the head with clubs, there was a continent south of India and throughout Asia called Kumari Continent. In Kumari Continent, the conditions existed where humanity could thrive. Now this is a story that's been passed to me through my teacher and through research that I've done. And so you can accept or reject it, but for the sake of the story, just follow along with me, please. So this population, who I believe are your ancestors, were great people. They had great knowledge and great science. I'll be walking in front of this numerous times, so Srini, please keep me abreast of this. They were very great people. And what was occurring as their civilization was flourishing was that the melting ice caps created an ecological disaster. The oceans raised, the sea level raised. This is verifiable. This is not some story made up. You can go and do research on sea level, and you'll see that it's raised more than 400 feet since then. Any land that was only 200, 300 feet above sea level began to be immersed. There were tsunamis. This global warming created hurricanes, tsunamis, tornadoes. It created even snow in regions where there wasn't snow, in higher mountains. So this great deluge occurred. 11,000 BC, 10,000 BC, around that time. How many have heard of these stories of the deluges? Raise your hand. How many have heard of it? Everybody's heard of it. Periods of deluge. And so the people in this great continent, of Kumari continent, had to vacate their land. They had to leave. And one story says that about 12 different groups left that area and traveled to other places around the world that were then habitable. And one man who came to be known as Mayan, M-A-Y-A-N, came to the mainland of India. He was a shipbuilder, he was a fisherman, he was a carpenter. He had 12 disciples. He came to the mainland and brought with him a great deal of knowledge. He was a great man in that he was able to have direct cognition from his Atman. He wrote a text on architecture, sculpture. He wrote a text on herbology, which is, by the way, extremely interesting and adds an amazing dimension to the science of herbology and the application of herbs. He wrote a text on shipbuilding. He wrote a text on space machines, air travel. This was 10,000 BC. He wrote a text called the Surya Siddhanta, which is a text on astronomy. The interesting thing about the way he addressed this is that the sun in the sky is not omniscient. There's only one thing that's omniscient and omnipresent, and that's consciousness itself. This great sun, the light of lights, that which gives luminosity to everything. And so we know that it was not God, the sun God itself, but this effulgent being that really gave him this knowledge. And that which is like the effulgent being, that man which is like the effulgent being, is Atman, the smallest particle in the cave of the heart, the divine spark that contains the divine flame within us. Atman is like that omnipresent, omniscient being. There's numerous references to this Atman and to this being who has inspired him, omnipresent being. And that is the source of this knowledge that we call Vaastu. Mayan says in the first verse of the Pranava Veda, Om light and Om sound are the primal source of all manifest forms. Om light is aroused by its own effort, in a state of disorder, and appears as a flame. The state of Om light and Om sound in space is a magnificent, luminous, six-faced light that is called Murukoli. The transformation of Om light and Om sound through the 5 stages is concealed in the 5-fold knowledge, of which this is the first. This process of transformation of disorderly Om light and Om sound into creative orderliness is found in all 5-fold material forms. This omniscient being acts of its own accord. It manifests itself of its own accord. It is autocatalytic, self-catalyzing. Now, what Mayan discovered is that there are specific stages in which manifestation occurs. Specific stages and steps. And those specific steps are mathematical in nature. Divine mathematics. We can think of a point. Mayan would say it's a cubical point. And that point is smaller than the smallest and larger than the largest. It is the point from which all of the manifest world arises. Mayan describes it as ekapada, that the field of consciousness is square. He speaks of it in the Pranava Veda as a burning ember. It's like a burning ember. We can say it's pregnant with potentiality. Pregnant with potentiality. If we look at it from a side view, can you see this? Is this? Can you all kind of get it in the back? Okay, good. Sideways, it looks like a line. Just a line. And Mayan speaks about this consciousness having infinite potential. And it wanted to know its own potential. It wanted to experience itself. The words that are used are that it was in love with its own beauty. In love with its own beauty. And what is its beauty? Its infinite potential. And this infinite potential means infinite, means everything. Every possibility existed in this field called consciousness. The good, the bad, and the ugly, the beautiful, the sublime, everything existed as a potentiality in this field of consciousness. Because it was in love with its own beauty, it wanted to experience it. To experience it, it had to manifest its individual qualities. It had to move. It had to have motion. So you can think about sitting in a bathtub, a hot bathtub, and you don't know, after a while, you don't know if that water's hot or cold, really. It just is. But if you move your hand, fluctuate your hand, then you know that it's hot or cold. How many have had that experience? Yeah. See? So consciousness had to move within itself. Had to move within itself to experience its own nature. To do that, it withdrew. It withdrew deeply into its own self. It withdrew, compacted, compressed. And then it gushed forward. Gushed forward as a cosmic pillar of fire. This pillar of fire has a cubical point at the top. Cubical in nature. As it gushed forward, it began to spin. So if we want to think of modern science, we have point theory. We have this concept of this pillar or string theory. And then we have spin theory. These are all concepts in physics. This whole process answers the origin of the string theory, spin theory, point theory. It's very, very interesting. I'm just giving you an overview. There are more things that I could say about it, but this is just an overview. So it begins to spin. As it spins, it throws off particles. Remember I just read? It throws them off in a disorderly fashion. There's all this disorder, all these particles of light being cast off from the central mulam, this Brahma Sutra. This thread is called Brahma Sutra. So consciousness realized that it had to contain itself to create order. So what happened is, according to Mayan, that this Brahma Sutra multiplied itself 4 times. I don't know if I can do this. It multiplied itself 4 times. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and filled in as a cube, mirroring its own self here, mimicking itself as this point, this cubical point. Now, what did this cube have? What did this giant cube? What was the function of this giant infinite cube? It was to create a boundary so that these waveforms, these were waveforms that consciousness created. It's like you have the still ocean, and then you have the churning ocean, the waveforms. It's all the same material. It's all H2O. So all of this is Brahman. Now, there's a very interesting thing. In my research, I wanted to understand this word Brahman a little more. And do you know that Brahman means to swell? Isn't that interesting? This is what happened. There was a swelling of consciousness. Brahman is a technical term. Now, it means other things to other people. But in this field, it's a technical term, which means the swelling of space itself. Space equal consciousness. To swell. I find that to be so interesting. There are lots of ramifications to that concept of swelling of consciousness. So this swelling of consciousness, this Brahman, created a form in which it could swell, spin, and throw off waveforms, particles, waveforms. And those waveforms were then able to become orderly by virtue of having this boundary to strike. Now, a very interesting mechanism occurred as this consciousness rose up, moved through time, descended, moved through time, creating what's known as a square wave. What actually occurred is that it took a shape, if I can draw this properly at the moment. Interesting shape, isn't it? If you examine a square wave, and I talk about this in my book, Fabric of the Universe, if you examine a square wave, you find this form, the swastika form, is nothing more than the pattern of a square wave spinning. And as it spins, it creates a 2 by 2 form. We go from this ekapada to a 2 by 2 form. Now, there's this concept called absolute time. T-I-M-E. Absolute time. Absolute time is different from conceptual time. Conceptual time is time on the clock. The sun rising and setting, the moon moving through its phases. That's conceptual time. Absolute time refers to a pulse in consciousness. That is, the time that it takes for this gushing to occur, the gushing, the spinning, in this waveform to occur. That's called absolute time. There's a great deal of knowledge behind this concept of time and kalam and kali. Very, very deep and profound information. You can use your imagination on that. But for now, let's just continue with this. The first particle, as time, as this waveform occurs, is what Mayan called Om light. Om light. Light, particles of light were emitted. He called that Om light, this luminosity of consciousness. And as this luminosity of consciousness, which were particles, cubical particles, as this luminosity of consciousness occurred, the particles began to rub against each other, causing a friction. And that created what we call Om sound. Does that sound familiar? Yes. Later on, we see that light turns into sound. And then later on, we see sound turns into light. But for now, we'll just say that we have space, time, Om light, and Om sound. Now, space and time combine and commingle, emitting light, which then these elements commingle and emit sound. Spinning, imagine this spinning and churning. Following this, we have space, time, light, and sound all commingling. They form a sort of crystalline structure, an unmanifest, this is all unmanifest, a crystalline structure of what we know as the air element. Air element. Then, air, space, time, light, sound, and air continue with the spin. Remember time. Remember, when you spin, like with centrifugal force, when you spin, there's an element of time to get from this point to this point. What happened when space, time, light, and sound, and air element commingled? It created fire element. Then we had space, time, light, sound, air, fire. They commingle and form water element. These elements commingle, forming earth element. The spinning continues, Om light, space, time, etc., all congealing and becoming more and more concrete. And it reaches a stage. What we have is this formation, an 8 by 8 grid on this cubical form called consciousness. This 8 by 8 grid represents or demonstrates fractals of consciousness differentiating outward. In other words, we have the formation of air, fire, water, earth. In in its subtlest unmanifest form. And remembering that this is spinning. It's this cubical form, it's a mandala, this cubical form then begins to continue to spin. And as it spins, the corners turn in on themselves. Bhagavad Gita says, when Lord Krishna was asked by Arjuna, how do you manifest this world? Arjuna says, curving back onto myself, I create again and again. Puna, puna. These forms curve back onto itself, creating a hexagon. Curving back onto myself, I create again and again. This continues to spin and creates a circular form. As it creates the circular form, it pops into manifest world. This is known as sattva, rajas, and tamas. A different concept than you might know of or you might have experienced. Sattva, rajas, and tamas. Do you know that the Shiva Lingam is a demonstration of this? Shiva Lingam is a demonstration of this stage. It's a demonstration of the manifestation of consciousness from the unmanifest Vaastu, V-A-S-T-U, to the manifest Vaastu. Do you know that the Nataraja was a concept conceived by Maharishi Mayan, to demonstrate this vibration of waveforms? So this is one of the secrets. This Shiva Lingam is a visual encoding of this knowledge of manifestation. Do you know that the temples in India are so ripe with this knowledge, these secrets, encoded in the icons, encoded in the building itself? The building itself is a form that contains knowledge of this manifestation process. Mayan discovered that this is definitely a mathematical process, and that we go from this 8 by 8 to what we call, after this occurs, we call a 9 by 9. I'm just going to draw a 3 by 3 to show you. That's a 9 by 9 grid. And this implies consciousness dividing itself so that it can shoot out qualities of itself. And each of these little 9 by 9 things are also divided 9 by 9, 9 by 9, 9 by 9. This is called the Vaastu Purusha Mandala. It is the blueprint of the manifest world, this 9 by 9. Blueprint of the manifest world. The 8 by 8 is the blueprint of consciousness itself. There is so much knowledge involved with this Vaastu Purusha Mandala. It's so ripe with information. It is rich with knowledge and the workings of the universe and the swelling of consciousness. What Mayan discovered is we as humans can take this mathematical order and apply it to art, painting and drawing, sculpture, dance, music, poetry, and architecture. We can use specific mathematical formulas in the 5 arts and create qualities of consciousness. Consciousness creates qualities, us, through this mathematical order. All we have to do is reverse engineer And we can create qualities of consciousness. There are 16 formulas for assessing any numerical value for its qualities of consciousness, if that numerical value is the perimeter of a house. For home building, we use 6. For town planning, we use 10 qualities, formulas. For temples, we use 16. It's one of the secrets of Vaastu. Vaastu Shastras, these formulas. So we can take these formulas and apply them to a building under certain conditions, and that building will vibrate. The building will vibrate. How many have been in a building that just doesn't feel good? Raise your hand. This idea of taking mathematics and applying to the arts to create a specific outcome is really profound. This is the most profound aspect of the science in terms of the technical side. Every building has a perimeter. Every building has a length, width. And that perimeter equals a number. 131 feet. 131 feet, 5 inches. 131 feet, 5 1/2 inch. We can take these numbers and apply the Vaastu calculations, Ayadi calculations. Nataraja brought me here tonight. Your inner Nataraja brought you here tonight. You are here with me tonight. We are here together because of the frequency that exists in our Atman. The qualities of consciousness that exist in our Atman brought us all here. Because Atman begins activating when this egg and the sperm unite. Boom! This cosmic upsurge, replicating this initial upsurge I spoke of. That happens when the egg and the sperm unite. And your frequency, the cosmic pattern, the qualities of Brahman that Brahman wanted to manifest through you so that it could experience its own beauty, begins to vibrate. Then we have this cell division. Atman starts to replicate itself, its qualities, as your body and as your life. Atman outpictures itself through you. Brahman outpictures itself through you, through your life. Your life is born of the frequency of your Atman, of the Brahma Sutra vibrating, your inner Nataraja. See, this isn't just about building houses, is it? It's a surprise, isn't it? You thought I was going to tell you where to put your front door. I can tell you that, but you won't understand it unless you understand this. You'll think it's some ooga booga superstition, witchcraft. I did. That's why I had to go further. I had to examine this knowledge. This Atman that vibrates inside of you, this beautiful, beautiful thing that you are, can be affected. It can be affected by the environment, by the food you eat, by the meditation you do. It can be affected by all those things, the people you surround yourself with. And not only can it be affected, it can be elevated. It can be completely changed. But there's only one thing that can completely change the vibration of your Atman, and that is the divine itself. Only the divine can change the divine. This thing in you is divine. You are divine. There's only one thing. You can learn to manage it. You can do psychotherapy. You can do all kinds of things to help you manage your existing vibration. And you can affect it. You can affect your life. But if you want to change it, the divine itself has to change it. One way that it changes it is through grace. How many have experienced divine grace just in your life? You just know that that thing happened only because of divine grace. Another thing that can change it are the arts, when Vaastu principles are applied to the arts, because they create a vibration. Traditional dance, I have a student who's a traditional dancer. She lives in the U.S., but she comes here every year. She has a master's degree in traditional dance. Bharatanatyam, yes. And this knowledge blew her away because she finally understands why a small click of the wrist can change the entire energy of the dance. It's mathematical. There's a book that tells you all the mathematics about dance. In that same way, the mathematics of a house create a vibration, and that vibration can change your Brahma Sutra. It's called resonance. You come into resonance with that building. You know, you can take a veena and pluck a string and have a veena next to it, and that string on that veena next to it will start to vibrate. You can do the same thing with tuning forks. Well, a house can do the same thing. A building can do the same thing. Pluck your string, your inner string. Can change the quality of your Brahma Sutra, which then changes the quality of your thought. The house doesn't make you do something. It changes the vibration in you, and then you outpicture something different. Do you understand this? It's really an interesting idea, isn't it? So, what we do with Vaastu Shastra is that we apply this principle of resonance and mathematical formulas. Oh, and there's one other thing. Interestingly enough, the earth is a Vaastu. It has a vibrating thread of consciousness. And this vibrating thread of consciousness forms this grid that I'm speaking of. This grid. This grid happens to be aligned with true north. North, south, east, and west. The energy that comes from the earth, the Vaastu energy that comes from the earth, is aligned with north, south, east, and west. So we have to align the building on this earth grid in order to capture this energy. So what we do is we create a building with specific mathematics that is aligned on the earth grid. That begins to activate the energy coming through the building. That energy then, in a sense, magnetically, it's not really magnetic, but in a sense, magnetically attracts consciousness itself. Vaastu. Vaastu attracts Vaastu. So about 10 feet above your house, consciousness begins to manifest the same qualities that are manifested in this house through the built space. The walls of the house, the main wall of the house, create the boundary for specific qualities based upon the perimeter to manifest. That's a mouthful, I know. It's a lot to grok. Are you following me? Then, these qualities attract the same qualities in consciousness. Consciousness rains down, manifests, boom, 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 manifesting right above your house. pouring into the building, spinning, churning, creating, guess what, the elements. Just like we mentioned before. Air, fire, water, earth. Manifest in the 4 regions of the house, the 4 corners. It's centrifugal force. This energy is churning and swirling. And so these elements are shot out and in order and sort of coagulate around the 4 areas. And when the house is on the grid, the earth grid, the Vaastu grid of the earth, that's what happens. When you have a positive number, mathematical order to your building, that's what happens. These are the 2 critical things. Mathematical order, the perimeter of the house, and alignment with the earth grid. Do you understand? Do you understand how the elements, I mean, I've given you, a whole lot of stuff in a short time. But this is why the elements are where they are. This is how they manifest. This is how energy, Vaastu energy doesn't come from the sun, the moon, and the stars. It comes from consciousness itself, immediately manifesting in the building, based upon the frequency. The wavelength, this is like a floor plan. You have this Brahmastan open, the center part of it. Waves come out and strike the wall. The distance between here and here creates a wavelength. Isn't that interesting? Creates a wavelength. That wavelength creates a quality. We know that waves have qualities. A blue light wave has certain qualities, color, values like that. A red one has certain colors like that. These are the same. These are Vaastu wavelengths. Qualities like abundance. We can actually make or break a person by the perimeter we build in a house. Do you know that? We can make or break a person. That's why this knowledge was kept secret. That's why there are all these books out there that are not accurate about Vaastu, because they didn't know the secrets. They looked at Vaastu houses and made up why everything was where it was. Why do we put the kitchen in the southeast, sorry. Fire element. That is predominantly where the fire element settles in a Vaastu building. The spiritual element is in the northeast. That's the water element. Earth element in the southwest. Nourishment. Rest. Air element in the northwest. Air helps with storage of grains and things like that. There are so many qualities, so many things that I wish we just had a month together. It's so profound. It's so amazing. And so what we have is a building that can make or break your life. It can bring spiritual bliss. Spiritual bliss is one of the qualities. Abundance and spiritual bliss are 2 qualities that always exist in a good Vaastu house. We actually can calculate those in. And it's through very precise measurements. I'm building 4 buildings in Arizona right now, and they are to a 64th of an inch. You know we have this concept of Shruti, divine revelation. Shruti. We know that the Veda are Shruti. Inviolable, can't be violated. Well, we also have Shruti in music. How many are musicians here? Yeah. You know, when there are certain notes that when a very talented musician moves his or her finger ever so minutely, they tap into a sound that brings spiritual bliss. How many have felt that listening to this classical music? Yeah. The sound It's a very minute sound. It's a very slight movement of the finger, and only a real master can give you this. That's Shruti. It reveals spiritual bliss. In Vaastu we have Shruti. Our mathematics are Shruti. This 23/64ths of an inch. One of my houses, the measurement is 23/64ths of an inch. If we want that house to vibrate, that's the measure we have to get. So, a lot of you have heard that you can take an existing house and rectify it, make it into a Vaastu house. I'll bet you almost, I'm not even going to ask you to raise your hands on this one. Because that's why you're here. But guess what? If it's not on the earth grid and it doesn't have this positive measure, it's not going to happen. You can do a couple things, maybe move a front door. But there's really nothing you can do short of tearing down the house. You're being misled if you think that you can change a silk purse from a sow's ear. You can't. This book, this is a textbook, core textbook for my students. Part of this is the science of manifestation and other things that I've mentioned. The majority of it are building codes. How do you maintain and support the Vaastu energy that's created in a building once you have the building on the grid and you have the proper mathematical order? That's what the rest of the Vaastu Shastra is about. It's about upholding the mathematical order, upholding the energy. So we place our doors in certain places, our windows in certain places. We don't put doors in the corners. Why? The majority of the energy is in the corners. Remember the air, fire, water, earth? It coagulates in the corners. If we put a door in the corner, we disturb that refined energy. It literally drains out of the house. And it creates disturbances based upon the element. Doesn't that make sense? Loss of energy. So the rest of Vaastu Shastra is focused on how to uphold and maintain this principle of consciousness and the qualities of consciousness that enter a building based upon orientation and mathematical order. And believe me, there are a lot of things that one has to do when building. Vaastu Shastra is about building from the ground up. That's what it's about. There is not one place, not one sentence in Vaastu Shastra about fixing a non-compliant Vaastu house. Not one word. Not one word. Everything that you hear is made up. People are innocent. People who want to help you as Vaastu consultants, they're innocent. They've read books and they think it makes sense, but it's not truth. It's not the fact. India would not have superstition like that in its Shastras. It simply wouldn't. You know that. Vaastu Shastras speak of repairing a Vaastu building, one that's Vaastu compliant, refurbishing, repairing, how to deal with temples, how to deal with statues, how to deal with existing Vaastu homes that are old. Did you know that a house has an age? A house has an age. That's one of our calculations. We won't build you a house that's going to lose its Vaastu energy in 10 years. There are perimeters of houses that will lose their Vaastu energy in 10 years. So this is what Vaastu is about. This is what it's about. There's, again, so much more to tell you. I mean, come to the U.S. and move to Patagonia, Arizona, and let's talk. Let's have coffee.